They're here to talk to you about the Talent Management Task Force. Colonel Spencer and Mr. Englen are here to kind of walk you through that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing them. You know who they are. They're here to address and give you an update on where the things are going, and certainly here and willing to answer any of your questions. So with that, guys, turn it over to you.
Hey, good afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Sean Spence. Today I'm going to talk just a brief overview. It's going to be relatively condensed compared to what we do, so I will be able to we will stay after to answer any of your questions in a more direct manner if required. I'm going to make three main points. I'm going to talk about the what, the why, and the how of how we're approaching talent management for the Army. So the Army is transforming the way that it equips and the way that it fights under Army Futures Command. Through the Army Talent Management Task Force, we are attacking the way that we man the organization. But the task force, it's just a team of teams. So for example, back in January, we ran a conference, 185 personnel representing all branches and all organizations in the HR domain for the Army. That has united us behind some of the guiding principles for talent management, which are right officer, right assignment, at the right time, over time. To do that requires granular level detail of the talent that we have in the Army, a better understanding that we have right now. And this is not focused on creating general officers. In fact, we think the greatest impacts are going to be the 6 to 60% of our population and unleashing that talent so the Army can utilize it. Army senior leadership has given us clear direction. We're not trying to make the current system better. We're not trying to make peripheral changes. We're trying to make an entirely new system. To do that, it's going to require us to change some Army cultural norms. The why. Why does the Army need a new system? So people define our Army. Other services, they really focus on platform or technology. We focus on people. The Army sees itself as the premier organization for human development. Many of the advantages that we've had over time are eroding. Advantages in industry, advantages in economy, advantages in technology. As we seek to maintain decisive advantage, talent management is going to be necessary for us to optimize our most precious resource. Talent management will allow us to adapt to changing technology and changing situations. The rate of technological change is only going to increase. In order for us to accomplish wholesale change, it requires us to look beyond the periphery. So consider 10x change versus 10%. An example would be that if you told a car engineer to move a 35 mile per gallon engine to 45 mile per gallon, he's going to look at that engine, he's going to take it apart, he's going to look for some places to gain efficiencies, reduce friction. But if you told him that he had to move to 500 miles per gallon, he's got to fundamentally re-examine what it means to be an engine. That's closer to what the direction that Army senior leadership has given us. So talent management's a new concept to the Army, so with that, it comes a new lexicon. Normally, I actually have a bunch of slides to go through that, but just to cover today, what I'll say is that talent management is done over the entire cycle of an officer's career: acquire, develop, employ, and retain. And we see talent as the intersection of knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences. Next slide. So this slide discusses the how. It's busy. I'll orient you to the slide. So on the left-hand side, we talk about the current system. On the right-hand side, we talk about the future system, and the bridges are going to be how we're going to get there. So inside the current system, first, it's really important to identify the strengths, what we want to maintain. So the system is perceived as being fair, scalable. It works for all 90,000 officers across the Army. It's predictable. As soon as you come into the Army, you have a good understanding of when you're going to get looked at for promotion throughout your timeline. And it allows us to understand what kind of accessions we need, how we're going to man positions, and it's resilient. It's served us well throughout the last 17, 18 years of war. But the system does have some gaps. It's challenged to adapt to new developments. such as getting technology and the right people inside the Army, new threats, even changes in the economy or changes in budget. It also incentivizes standardized career paths. It's data poor, meaning that there's lots of things that we don't know about our people that we don't use to make HR decisions. And it's time-based. So on the right side, we talk about a future system. We want to sustain those things that I discussed, but we also want to create a system that can adapt to disruptive change. We want to create a system that matches officers based on their talents. And we want to make the system more flexible so people don't have to worry about pursuing certain career opportunities that sometimes end up being to the detriment of their careers. We want to make it data rich through assessments, which I'll cover in a second. And we also want to make it talent and competency based. So we're going to achieve this through relooking our organization, changing our alignment to make sure that we have unity of effort. We're looking at instituting a process to make sure that we get information, trends to Army senior leadership so they can make strategic decisions on what we're doing with the force. And we're going to do that also through something called ATAP, the Army Talent Alignment Process. So that brings me to bridge number one. So the Army Talent Alignment Process is essentially a regulated market. And what we're trying to do is bring more transparency to the way officers are assigned. So in this, currently, you can get in, if you're a movable officer, right now it's only to Compo 1, and that's because the system, TOPMIS, is only viewable to active duty officers, but this will branch out. But an active duty officer, by 1 October, all of the assignments will be received through this process. In this process, you'll be able to see all the jobs that are open for your movement cycle. You'll be able to list your KSBs, your knowledge, skills, behaviors, and your preferences. And then unit strength managers will be listing the knowledge, skills, behaviors required from each job, and the market will clear through a matching process. And they're actually working the business rules at this time. The marketplace is currently run through Army manning guidance because we have more positions than we have people, so we've got to figure out who goes where, and those constraints are going to be worked out. Second bridge is assessments. So everyone's familiar with evaluations, OERs, NCOERs. They're subjective. Different leaders emphasize different things. And you contrast that with assessments, which are objective. So APFT would be a good example of objective. It's of an assessment. That's conducted the same way from Korea to Kuwait. So we're looking at instituting these assessments throughout the life cycle of an officer's career, through different points in PME, different kinds of assessments. Some assessments will be diagnostic, telling the individual about themselves. Some will be developmental, letting the institution know how they should develop this individual. So for the benefit of the individual and for the benefit of the institution. And the last kind would be predictive, trying to figure out how to best utilize that individual. So I want to touch on talent-based branching. Some people do not know that we've been using assessments in a process called talent-based branching for 5 years at West Point, 3 years at ROTC. Inside that process, all the officers in that time frame took an assessment in their first year and their third year. That assessment has helped inform them about the different branches and change their preferences. And then through that process, the branches also preference each one of the candidates. So these soldiers that you guys have already got in your formations right now are already used to this assessment process and understanding what their skills are and being seen as a value to the institution through that lens. So we're also looking at changing the flexibility in our career paths and the way that we promote people to a less time-based system. And then lastly, for the last bridge, promotions and selections. So in August of 2018, Congress gave us the largest expansion to our authority that we've had since 1980. They gave us 9 new authorities. The Talent Management Task Force, in concert with other organizations, developed COAs. The senior leadership have approved some of those COAs, and we're pursuing policy to institute some of those new authorities. Just to mention just a few of them, merit-based promotions, we're going to start looking at promoting officers based off of the way that they perform. That's going to occur as soon as the summer majors board. We're looking at giving the opportunity for officers to opt out so they're not at risk if they pursue certain, like advanced civil schooling, for example. And that could be happening as soon as 2020. And we've got some other authorities that we're working on policy to implement, such as direct commission to 06 and something called brevet promotion. So with that, based off of jobs being designated, you could say that an 05 is the right person for this 06 job, put him in that particular position, and he'll be promoted and receive pay for that time. Mr. Englen is going to talk about how we're utilizing these authorities, how we're going to utilize these authorities and bring this into the warrant officer population.
Thank you, sir. CW5 Englen, I've been on the Talent Management Task Force off and on, starting about 3 years ago when I was stationed at Fort Bragg, and it was our contribution. So Talent Management Task Force has been in existence for about 3.5 years, but with today's senior leadership, with the Secretary of the Army, the Vice, the Chief, and the Under, they have wholeheartedly empowered the Talent Management Task Force charter to directly report to the Secretary of the Army and the Vice of immediate opportunities. So basically, we look at the Army as the entire enterprise. And so I was brought on the team in June to start looking at warrant officer inefficiencies and where we can actually start embarking on some of the things in legislation that allow us, but we've never actually acted on. So good afternoon, Major General Evans and Lieutenant General Palumbo. Welcome. And so I'm going to focus this more on an aviation-centric, because I'm looking at all compos, all branches, and there are things that we found out we were doing in AG branch that we could actually apply in aviation branch. And I'll cover the next slide, please. And one more. There is a website for talent management. You can Google it. We actually have a website, and there's in a Facebook page to kind of announce some of the things directly from the Secretary. But we had to find out why we are in the situation and the framework that we have today. So back from 1918, from our first warrant officers 101 years ago, Paul, you remember those days. So back from those days, there have been many, many evolutions and advancements in warrant officer history, to the point where all branches had it to include the Air Force, but the Air Force then converted their warrant officer positions to E8s and E9s, and that's where they've been ever since. So the Air Force still does not have it. The Marine Corps and the Navy use it as an extension of their E8s and E9s, primarily. That's not necessarily how we work, about halfway in the tech side, and definitely not necessarily on the aviation side. But focusing on 1981, that was when the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act was enacted, and warrant officers were exclusively written out of commissioned officer personnel management system. Not by design to further segregate, it's because there was no representation for warrant officer management and career models at the time, so they didn't want to actually hurt the warrant officer career model at the time. So the Total Warrant Officer Survey came about. The background of that, it was Army that came to DOD, since we are 90% of DOD's population, and said this is how warrant officers should be managed, and the Navy and the Marine Corps followed suit. Well, what they did is they took the officer career model, placed it over on warrant officers, and then grew the rank of CW5. It disbanded the warrant officer branch, the Rising Eagle, and put every warrant officer in their respective branches, and we have lived with that. If you notice, 1988 is when that survey started for WOMA, Warrant Officer Management Act. So it's been over 30 years since we've looked at the efficiencies of the warrant officer personnel management system. We've had some small education, like you see the Chief Staff of the Army, the Training and Leader Development Panel, and a lot of other small ratifications to the law, but they've been happy to glad, and a couple other things for inefficiencies, but nothing at the level of the Total Warrant Officer Survey over 30 years ago. Now, we are charged to look at it holistically as the Talent Management Task Force, and that's why I'm engaging every branch to figure out exactly where the current framework is now inhibiting talent, and it's actually restricting a lot of readiness. In some aspects, when you have some warrant officer that can't extend beyond 15 years of warrant officer service because of our promotion system, That's lethality. We've lost experience. So the data point is warrant officers used to be 20 plus years of in-depth experience. Truly, now warrant officers from an aggregate have less than 20 years of experience and getting less because of our promotion system. Next slide. So here's some of the, from an aviation branch perspective, here's what we can absolutely do today, and we are going to, some of these by the end of the calendar year. And Major General Gaylor absolutely concurs, and aviation branch will be the first one to incept this, but time and grade longevity for W1s. They will still be appointed W1 at Warrant Officer Candidate School. They're going to go through flight school as a W1, but as soon as they are MOS qualified, but this also applies towards all other warrant officers in all branches, even the tech warrants, that starts the 24-month clock for their credit for CW2. So they'll gain a full 2 years as a Warrant Officer 1 in their first unit, regardless of how long they were in flight school. The exception of policy expected for cyber, because they have a 72-week train-up for cyber. So we don't want to disadvantage that or hurt recruiting for them, so we're going to allow them to actually go a little bit less. But that's the only one. Everybody else, AG warrant officers, MPs, engineers, they're all going to be 2 years time as a W1 in their first unit. Probationary law was given to us in 1991 with WOMA. So when we started promoting warrant officers right away, the secretary in the first 3 years of a warrant officer's career, they can be pulled out of their rank, and the secretary can do that. We cannot delegate that below the Assistant Secretary of the Army Manpower Reserve and Affairs. So the ASA MNRA has that authority. So we're going to staff pack it. It's going to go straight to the branch chiefs. The branch chiefs will be able to enact that probationary law staff packet, and we're talking weeks now that a failed warrant officer in training will be revoked of their W1 and revert back to their previous status, whether it be out of the Army, offered a enlisted rank or enlisted MOS if they were street to sea, or go back to their previous MOS, and then so on and so forth. If they were a captain, they'd go back to their pre-commission. So there's that process. And there's more to follow on that, and I can talk to you offline on the actual process. But what it is, it's an approval change. So now it takes months for that to occur. We're going to streamline the process. CW 2s, 3s, and 4s for assignment. It starts with the units. The units create their mission essential list. It's combined, commissioned officer and warrant officer. Army Madden guidance is going to stay the same. The unit requirements are going to stay the same. But low density MOSs like a 420 Alpha or Bravo will actually probably get below the cut line from an Army Madden if they're a 70 or 80% unit. So we're going to separate warrant officer and commissioned officer assignment process. The distribution managers up at HRC, the assignment officers at HRC are going to now start managing warrant officers. And we're going to go to a 1 year manning cycle to probably no manning cycles and just have a continuous 365 manning cycle for warrant officers so it's appropriate. So now we can start looking at a smaller population pinpoint and focusing on the talent when it needs to move. Because there are always going to be less desirable positions out there, and there are more positions than there are warrant officers. But that'll also be an OPMD directive to the distribution managers there at OPMD. And then, so these are not mandatory for branches to take part in. The assignment will be, but some branches can and cannot take part in them in some of these, but I'm understanding the aviation branch will absolutely take part in like the W1 longevity. Okay, so CW5. This has been a hard question to answer from the secretary. He asked, what does the CW5 do? And that's extremely hard to answer other than they are in service longer than a CW4. And truly, a W5 does not give any more authority. It does not give from a UCMJ. So according to MCM, Military Court Martial, a CW2 and a CW5 have the same MCM, UCMJ authority. They have no court martial authority, and it's only company grade. So right now, it's undefined what a CW5 has over a 2, 3, or 4 that are also commissioned warrant officers. So what we're looking at is the talent data collected on a CW5 on a current OER is insufficient. It's not enough writing space, and it's not enough strategic information on there to make a determination to create an OML for CW5s. So a strategic bridging strategy is to start using the 06 OER for CW5s, and it's mandatory for all CW5s, even if you're serving at the 3 or 4 star level, for the purpose of capturing that talent data to then start conducting through OPMD first as a panel. Every CW4P and above, regardless of how long you've been wearing the rank, will get looked at and racked and stacked against the other 586 CW5s in the Army, and that's across active component only. So you're going to have a 1 to enlist for OML. W5s will then be attending a force management school for 1 week, and then attached to the FIXL, which is the force management update for the 1 and 2 stars in the nation's capital region, to actually be educated on force management and how the Army runs, and then SLS will be on the backside of it, which we're already doing anyways. So what it does, it creates this annual review board, will create that OML then to find out who needs to go to that. And those will be offered for nominative CW5s. Then the following year, it's going to turn into from a panel to a DA Secretariat board, which will then open the category. You reverse the OML, and then that's the list for SERB. The Secretary and the Vice have said, I want to look at 5 and 6 year time and grade CW5s. More times than not, it's going to be a target of 0, but then 5 and 6 year time and grade CW5s will then have an annual board for those for a performance review board. And it's not necessarily for a SERB every year, but it's to now capture the ones that have DROG or a score of 0 or a score of 1 that are unqualified to continue service beyond. So it's not necessarily to filter out and start downsizing or reducing the W5 population, it's to find the ones that are underperforming at that time. The fourth thing that annual board will provide is those that are at 29, 30 years of warrant officer service. Well, then that list can go to the Secretary. The Secretary then will be able to extend that warrant officer's career to age 62 or as desired or directed by the Secretary. That's the fourth output that will come from that board. So strategic education, we know, is not being offered to CW5s, and more importantly, it's not being offered to CW5s going into nominative positions, CAP CCWOs, branch chiefs, the branch chief, or even like a USAREC command chief, warrant officer. Those positions that you are nominated, not assigned, need to have just a little bit of extra push for education when it comes to that. We'll pray you. Next slide. Okay, competitive categories. It is not purely for promotions. Competitive categories are, if you look in 600-3, it's to align an officer and a warrant officer's career path for how long you're in grade, what education, military education you receive, and truly your promotion and your strengths and how deep in you are in your field. And it will say by regulation and by law that warrant officers in a specific competitive category will not compete with another warrant officer of another competitive category. So right now we have 2. It's aviators and all other warrant officers. So the problem is, and you can just kind of see from the slide, I didn't have to explain what the problem is. I mean, you have a cyber warrant officer competing against military, police, against special forces. So, and it's not just from a packet. It's year group management. We are going to start pulling away from a year group management, and we're going to look at a percentage-based management for selection. The example is, if with establishment of competitive categories, even with the aviation branch, and just as an example, you could have attack, lift, and fixed wing, separate competitive categories. And if you're allowed 40 promotions a year for aviators, then the number would be slotted for what the requirements are for each one of those. And if we want 50% promotion, and you're allowing 10 promotions instead of B5, you're only going to look at the first 20 primary zone W4s, and then you're going to close the window for the zones of consideration. The rest of them will be BZ, which means we're turning less than half away for once non-select and twice non-select annually, and extends a W4's career out to about 8 to 10 years in grade as a CW4 before you're actually up for W5. The other part of that for talent management is to increase BZ to a full 10%. So those that are overperformers from a BZ perspective, we're going to pick up a lot more of those, and that way we're going to promote talent, and that way you can have an advancement. This is the model that we are looking at in placing on the commission officer career model, but with smaller populations, as almost a pilot for the commissioned officer personnel management system. This is the direction we're going for warrant officer promotions. And if there's any questions, please bring those up when we're finished here. Next slide. All right, legislation. Legislation was passed for all DOTMA. Keep in mind, DOTMA is just a reference because there's law that regulates commissioned officer career management. DOTMA is just a quick reference. WOMA was not updated. So when the Senate allowed the military of all branches to now start applying a lot of these law changes, none of them were written to amend warrant officer law. So I had to do the crosswalk a lot of these, and most of them do not apply because we don't have chaplains, we don't direct commission to 06. We have that law already. An example of a law that we have already that allows us, we can appoint to W1, we can appoint to CW2, and we can appoint to CW3 right out of warrant officer candidate school. It's up to the Army, it's up to the branch to define what the prerequisites are to that grade. So right now, Field Artillery and Air Defense are drafting the policy now that if you are E7 with greater than 12 years or E8, they're going to promote them directly to CW2 because of a save pay issue, and they need to open their talent pool. And those are the solutions that they're looking at. Aviation branch could absolutely take part of that as well too, but it's up to the branch. So we're drafting the framework, and you take part on what you actually want to enact. If you want an older population and start them at a higher rank for save pay, absolutely go for it. And we're going to explain more of that and what are the advantages, disadvantages of that, but it's up to the branch to decide. So opt out for promotions. It's going to be the same for warrant officers. The categories, you cannot just opt out because of personal preference. You cannot have BROG and say, I have no chance of getting promoted, I'm going to opt out. That is not the case. The officer, and this is what Major General Gaylor was talking about, the captain intermission program, it's under the laws of opt out. So a captain or a warrant officer is going into a position that is deemed critical to the branch or to the Army, that this is a critical position that the Army needs, but that position will interfere with their career, whether it be not insufficient OERs, but they may be going into a civilian population, and they know they're going to have a DA civilian or a non-U.S. Army Raider or senior Raider that could put them at risk. That position would allow that officer or warrant officer then to opt out for the amount of years that they are in that position. Now, if they did it as a CW2 and they're up for the CW3 board, they could also apply it when they're up for the CW4 board. There's no expiration of when you can opt out because it gets so competitive that all your files are looked at your entire career. That's really what opt out is. So it's by position deemed, and it has to be approved by the Secretary of the Army by position, and the individuals are only for advanced civil schooling. So if a warrant officer did 1 year degree completion and feels is non-competitive for the next grade, that warrant officer would be able to opt out because that is advanced civil schooling by the law, and that's the best example to use if that's the case. By the way, in an 11-year period, Aviation branch had 6 warrant officers partake in degree completion. It's completely underutilized. That's just the data. Okay, merit-based promotions. The Navy is doing it now. We're following with the Majors Board this summer. Merit-based is now an OML sequence number. For commissioned officers, we only wanted to bracket it for a percentage and with some algorithms, maybe the top 15 or 20%, because we didn't want to advertise who was on the last of the list, because commissioned officers are selected based on merit. And if they know they're bottom on the merit list, because if we go straight list, it doesn't apply and it can disadvantage the commissioned officer. Warrant officers, different story. So we have requested, and legislation, the Senate has it now, to put it into law for the top 2, these top 2 on there, for FY20, this coming October. So we're scrambling to develop the policies to adapt it for a 1 to N list for warrant officers for merit base. So if you were BZ and you were #1 in the Army, you're getting promoted October 1st. Doesn't matter, we're not going to do AZs, primary, and then below the zones at the very end of the year. You're going to be promoted in the year based on your number on the merit list. So if you perform, you're going to get promoted early. Alternate promotion authority is based on competitive category. legally you can't apply it towards the person, legally you can't apply it towards an MOS. It has to be a competitive category. So as the example, and I'm, without any, without committing it to too much, but an example would be an attack, lift, fixed wing, special operations, however you want to break out based on the branch. You can apply alternate promotion authorities, which is in lieu of twice non-select, which then the secretary then approves twice, 3, 4, up to 5 times non-select with CELCON ability at the end. We have asked for that, and that'll probably come around in FY21. So those are the things that if in the event of surge, and you want to apply that to the branch, and you have an attrition problem, you can offer that. It's predictability in a warrant officer's career to actually show that I can go to this time, not looking 5, pinning 6. That's not going to, that rigidness in a promotion timeline is going to go away. Okay, brevet temporary promotions applies much more for commissioned officers, warrant officers. It will apply in a few positions. What it is, it's based on a position that the branch or the ACOMs have determined that it requires to have a rank and let's say like the military academy flight detachment position is a W5 position. And the branch has identified it has to be a W5 because the influence, because remember the authorities, the W5 doesn't have any more authority than a W4, but is deemed to have a W5 in that position. You've run out of W5 talent, and now you have some W4s that can fill that position. You can identify that W4. They are promoted to W5, getting paid W5 in that position, and if they come out of that position, they go back to being at CW4. So it's a good management tool now for, where's Rick Knowlton at? You could actually go through with the branch and identify those that are of merit and are really, and through a MOP, a measure of performance, you'd actually find out those that should be promoted to W5, so then you're looking at that. So that's really what a brevet temporary promotion is. On a commissioned officer side, there's 770 positions in the Army that are allowed by law. Law says you could have 100 colonels, you could have 200 lieutenant colonel, and it's like 320 majors, and it's about 200 captains that are allowed to be identified by the Army that if you can't fill it. The example is Fort Polk, major position that you can't get enough majors to volunteer, and instead of mandatory assigning a major there to hurt their career, there may be a captain down here that wants to volunteer for it. They promote them to major, they get paid for major. When they're done with that Fort Polk assignment, they come back out and become as a captain. That will also be coded for the opt-out as well too, because that's the incentive. So the direction from the Secretary is to incentivize and then regulate. That's the new talent management system. Okay, the last things I don't have on slides. Predictive CELCON is an example the Navy has given us, and the ASA of an array agrees with it, but the branches need to look this over. Instead of telling CELCON individuals that they're selective continuation after they're twice non-select, they are notified that their MOS is going to be offered CELCON before their one-time non-select. So on their first look, it would be open in category. The ORSs and PRS and DMPM have the ability to do that, to pre-announce what that is, so that's predictability. So we're not losing that talent of those that are one-time non-select and exiting service because they don't want to wait for the second look. Pay modernization is already in the Title 37 docket now for FY21 and 22 to look at significant increases in W4 and W5, 22 years and greater. And then taking it from there as the incentivization for those W4s that wish to not compete for W5 down the road, incentivization to stay on the line, and then go from there. The last one is from a legal standpoint, JAG has reviewed it. Congressional legislators have come back and said it's within the spirit of the law. And from a policy perspective, we are going to establish the policy now to allow active component retired warrant officers maintain their retirement pay and serve in Compo 2 or Compo 3 and drill with them. M-Day only. If they are active guard, then they assume their active guard pay. The example is a 22-year W3 or 22 W4 is now going to go to the Tennessee National Guard. They're going to maintain their retirement, and every day that they drill, they forfeit 1/30 of the retirement pay. So if the retirement pay is $300 or $3,000 a month, they're only going to forfeit $100 for that day, but they're going to gain drill pay. Title 38 is now amended as well. It's in the for FY20 that the VA said that they're going to do the same thing. So if you have a VA compensation, you forfeit 1/30 of your VA, you gain your drill pay, and you continue. The other example is if you did 10 years in the National Guard, that equates to about 3 years of active time. When you're finished drilling, you add that 3 years to your 20 years of retirement. You'll have 23 years and it'll be recalculated at that point. We are moving out on this. So this is a huge deal for Complet 2 and 3 and a big force provider. And that's all I have, sir. Anything else to add? There are some other small things we're doing just to kind of clean up some of the law, but open for questions from this point out.
Stock aviation branch proponent. We get a lot of requests from commanders in the field requesting to upgrade positions from CW4 to CW5. When you look at talent management task force and allowing folks to stay longer in those grades, are there any other actions at HQDA or within talent management task force that would minimize the number of W5 positions going forward?
Okay. Force management under the G3 has been charged over the last 2.5 years to do a roll down of positions. They are rolling down captain positions and they're rolling down commissioned officer positions and they're rolling down enlisted positions. The goal is to get below 50% from an enlisted NCO to lower enlisted ratio. We have been allowed to not roll down warrant officer positions at the G3 level to figure out what talent management, what these initiatives will look like, and once we model it to see what the structure would look like down the road. So we start extending W4 careers. We're actually going to widen the shoulders quite a bit on inventory of warrant officers out there, which will then create your review of what the warrant officer structure should look like based on the new promotion environment. That's what that is. So force management is not going to direct roll downs of warrant officer positions. So if that's come about, that's probably where some of that came from. The example of why they will not roll down commissioned officers to warrant officer positions anymore, because in 2013, when we rolled all those positions down with the Budget Control Act, we rolled down 400 captain and major positions to create CW2s to save the Army money immediately. Over a 3-year period, it increased the warrant officer population by 1,000 authorizations because at 400 W2s had to create 300 W4s, had to create W3s and then W4s, so on, to create a career path. So rolling that out actually cost the Army more because it added 600 positions and it all went into the technical side. It did not go into the aviator side. That's why we will not do that. And Major General Menez, the DAMO FM, and the G3 has said we're not going to do that. Sir?
How's it going, Lieutenant Colonel David Anita? A couple questions on the officer side of the house. Talking about that one of the 4 bridges is for assessments and, being the differences between the subjective and the objective. And, the example you gave was the APFT as one of the assessments. What are some of the other examples of objective assessments that could or have been used?
So great question. So we're actually piloting some of the different ways we're going to do assessments. One of the pilots, coincidentally, happens to be the Aviation Captain's Career Course. So this summer, Aviation Captain's Career Course and Logistics Career Course, the Captain's Career Course, they're going to start taking the GRE. The idea is to start getting a better feel for academically how ready people are going to be for advanced civil schooling. There's a lot of different assessments, and we're kind of refining those tools that we want to start implementing at different points, primarily PME insertion points throughout an officer's career. So it's already happening at the commissioning sources. We talked about the GRE, but that's only going to be a small portion of what we think this larger assessment model is going to look like at these different PME insertion points. Then it'll, of course, go through ILE and Senior Service College. The types of assessments will change, looking at diagnostic, ranging to developmental, ranging to predictive as as guys increase in longevity. But those are some of the different assessments that we're looking at. So one, to help people know themselves and understand what their strengths are, to help them work within their strengths, to help the institution understand how to develop people in order so the institution benefits and the individual benefits. And then the last one, predictive, is to figure out where best to employ that person, both based off of the knowledge and training that they've accumulated within the institution, outside the institution, where the institution can benefit the best.
Another second question then, is there any proposed changes other than the CW5 evaluations of like OERs? Is there any looking at changing OERs at all?
So it's, I'd say I'd call that kind of a parking lot issue. We've identified that as Mr. Englen talked about the OER, I talked about it being subjective. He talked about it being, it's somewhat kind of one-dimensional. So what we're trying to do is utilize those assessments, not just at PME insertion points, but also to get senior leaders, battalion commanders, brigade commanders, more objective information about their people so they can use that information to influence the way they do their evaluation. Whether or not we change the OER, that's not something we're taking on right now, but it's something that as this process continues to progress, that's something that we have identified that we might have to look at.
Yes, sir, I may be able to add to that. So the Office of Economic Manpower Assessment, OEMA, up at West Point, they're conducting like a mock board, and they're actually running board process based on the last 2 or 3 years of boards for officers. Officer and warrant officer boards are conducted with the exact same regulatory constraint and everything. So they're using that to analyze the talent data that's in the current OER, figure out where those, run their gap analysis, and that's going to be the information to feed a new OER in the future. So it'll be a 67, dash 11 or whatever it's going to be, with the purpose, be very purposeful to develop the data that would be needed for a future OER. Knowing that we will have probably specific warrant officer OERs, we don't know it until we come out. We do know that W5s need to have a little bit more written on them contextually. There will be no block check because it's not promote to BG, anything that's on the 06 OER. But now it's going to, the board members are going to be forced to read. But if that answers, OEMA is looking at it for the purpose of updating the OER down the road.
And then one final question, talk about the talent management for officers. Can you discuss how functional areas fit into that? Is it that we're talent managing the combat arms branches and possibly selecting people to fit into the functional areas, or will there be talent management within functional areas for specific positions, et cetera?
So the way that I would kind of give you an analogy to understand the way that we're looking at it, right? So we've been given the authorities of Congress. Once we've been given the authorities, the talent management teamed up with different proponents has come up with COAs in ways that we could use that, use these different authorities, and then we're going to work policy for implementation. But to your question, I would say that we're trying to give, so AR 600-3, the basic document is owned by the G1. The proponents own their annexes on Mill Suite. So this is the way we see that. We're going to give broad authority, broad discretion to the proponents, and then let the proponents kind of develop how they want to use that. So all the things that you mentioned, I'd say are on the table. And based off of the 9 authorities we've been given, and probably other ones that we're going to seek in the future, the idea is to let the proponents figure out how best to use that based off of the unique requirements inside that particular branch. Functional areas are we're looking at functional areas in a lot of different ways. Anything you want to add on that, Doug?
Yes, sir. So Talent Management Task Force is going to model these and figure out what the population density is going to look like. So the new personnel management system for commissioned officers and warrant officers are going to look like this. So PRS and PRP within the G1 are starting to model this, and then we're going to once we model it to figure out what it looks like, we're going to start sharing with the branches to back that data up. That will then define what the career model is going to look like to help advise how we're going to rewrite 600-3. We're not charged to write 600-3. We're here to develop the framework and then identify what that's going to look like in a career model. And then the branches are still going to be, because it's inedible, you're going to update 600-3 based on competitive categories. Functional area officers are in your own competitive categories. So that will maintain, but we're going to define it and veer away from a year group management.
And just the last part to that, I would actually, one of the questions that General McGee has been asking as he does some of these presentations, at Fort Hood, we engage like 600 01s through 03s, and he would ask, how many of you guys think that command is necessary? Then we engage a bunch of 04s and 05s, ask the same question. Engage a bunch of 06s and ask the same question. We anticipated differing responses based off of how, the longevity in people's careers. And overwhelmingly, the answer that we came back from each one of those engagements was the majority of people did not think command was a requirement. So that's just some of the feedback that we're getting. So when you talk about functional areas, that has a really big implication for how functionaries intake their people. Like right now, a lot of functionaries don't want to take risk on taking a guy that has not been branch qualified, because then he'll be at risk for promotion and they lose that person and lose the training. So still to be worked out, and a lot of that's going to be based off the proponent's ability or proponent's desire to accept that different amount of risk and how they view that population. But what we are trying to uncork is that conversation on whether or not command is necessary for that particular branch. Any other questions? All right.
Okay, thank you.